As Ukraine continues offensive operations, even if it is at a glacial pace that may only slow during the winter, things will inevitably start heating up with more murmurs of Russian nuclear weapons use. This has been a recurring theme throughout the war, to say the least. Indeed, any advances by Ukraine are not going to stem that tide. And although media coverage of the Kremlin's threats has often been disproportional relative to the likelihood of actual atomic use, even a tiny chance of a nuclear calamity is still enough to keep US policymakers up at night. And when policymakers cannot sleep, they tend to think through solutions to their political problems. With that in mind, this video will look at the menu of options that Washington has available in the event of a Russian nuclear attack. To be clear, we are not talking about these because the United States will likely have to use any of them in all actuality. Rather, because Washington has these options at its disposal, and some of them will cause great pain to Russia, the Kremlin will internalize the consequences for nuclear use, and then calculate that it is better to keep the nuclear weapons in the basement. In turn, this allows the United States and Ukraine to ignore Russia's nuclear threats as nothing more than saber-rattling. But again, such saber-rattling will be inevitable if Ukraine starts making serious headway in its offensive. More specifically, we will be focusing on Washington's response to Russia attempting to detonate a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukrainian military targets. That is because, as unlikely as any nuclear attack is, tactical use remains the most probable, and how the United States would respond to a strategic nuclear attack on Kyiv, or any attack on US targets, would be a completely different conversation. More specifically, we'll discuss two options to preempt the attack from happening at all, and a wide range of choices afterward, including doing nothing, ramping up economic sanctions, expanding assistance to Ukraine, conducting strikes on Russian launch facilities, using an expanded response, firing a tactical nuclear retaliation, and finally launching a strategic nuclear strike. And yes, I realize it is weird to title a video "How to Prevent a Nuclear Attack," and then spend the vast majority of the time talking about what would happen afterward. But that is just how policymakers think about deterrence. One does not simply stop an opponent with proactive measures all the time. And actually, we have seen much of this logic already at work. I started writing this video way back in October 2022, which was already months after we started hearing Russian nuclear threats. More than a year has passed since those whispers began, and we still haven't seen Russia actually use them. And it's all because of that deterrence thing. But we start with the most basic step to stop Russia: announce the movement of tactical nuclear weapons. Intelligence and US policymakers indicate two basic facts about the nuclear situation, as we discussed ages ago during the peak threat season of October 2022. 1. Russia's tactical nuclear arsenal is in storage and would need to be brought closer to Ukraine before they could be used. And 2. The US has sufficient monitoring capability that would observe any changes to Russia's deployments. These facts on the ground changed somewhat in 2023, when Belarus began hosting some Russian nuclear weapons. This concerned Washington, but still did not raise the alarm, because there would be yet more steps to prepare them for delivery from Belarus to the battle site. I should note that there is a lack of clarity within open sources about what exactly is happening with those transfers, and confusion from me why Americans are still in Belarus. But the key thing here is that Russia cannot take the West by surprise by using a second country. Thus, the most basic thing that the US could do is alert the world to what Russia is up to. That has been a central part of the US strategy of the war thus far. Even going back to the beginning of the conflict, the White House was telegraphing all of Russia's serious moves to rally international support against Moscow. That would be the goal here too. The announcement would create a diplomatic showdown reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US observed the Soviet Union deploying nuclear weapons to Cuba and used the United Nations as a forum to apply diplomatic pressure to Moscow. By making the problem urgent, Washington would hope to trigger swift diplomatic action from China and India. Both of those countries have tolerated Russia's actions so far, with India abstaining on related votes in the United Nations, and China alternating between abstaining and vetoing, depending on the specific language. However, as we have discussed before, China is still reluctant to help Russia, and both have signaled that use of nuclear weapons would be unacceptable. Revealing Russia's maneuver would force China and India to put their money where their mouths are. That would mean withdrawing their implicit financial support for the war by ending their energy trade with Russia. The same goes for the European countries still importing Russian gas. Recognizing the impending problem, Putin might withdraw the missiles, preferring to continue the conventional war and keep the ongoing trade, to a nuclear war without trade. Alternatively, the US could take proactive measures by preemptively striking the missile sites or transports. Make no mistake, the United States going after Russian nuclear weapons would be an enormous escalation, and it would draw the world the closest it has ever been to World War III. Nevertheless, the idea would be to destroy the weapons before they can hit Ukraine, and signal to Russia that further deployments would receive the same treatment. The risks here are obvious. It is possible that any tactical deployment is merely a bluff, designed to scare Ukraine into ending its counteroffensive. If so, attempting preemption puts Russia into a corner. If there is any forewarning that the attack will happen, then Russia may fire the weapons before they get destroyed. This creates a use-it-or-lose-it dilemma for the Kremlin. Ironically, Washington trying to stop a nuclear winter could actually create the problem. The same goes if only 4 out of the 5 preemptive strikes work. The 5th commander is going to get trigger-happy. Then there is the question of how Russia would retaliate. One would imagine there would be some kind of response. Whether that is limited to strikes on the bases that originated the American attack, or something broader, is something that only Putin's inner circle knows. The point is that there would be US and European casualties, and the potential for a ton of them. Never mind that we are likely talking about a European base, which raises the question of what would happen at the subsequent NATO Article 5 meeting. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President John F. Kennedy was presented with similar options, but instead chose a quarantine of the island, precisely to avoid risking runaway escalation. There is also a Russian domestic political dimension to this. Since the start of the conflict, Putin has tried to frame the war as a fight to stop Western influence over Russian politics. The United States has been careful not to fuel that narrative, both by keeping US soldiers out of Ukraine and within NATO allies like Poland and Romania, and also limiting Ukrainian use of US weapons to targets inside of Ukraine. US missiles hitting Russian targets would inject nitro into that narrative. One of the ways Ukraine wins the war is via an uprising in Russia. Such a response might reduce the chances of that outcome. Before getting to what could happen post-detonation, it is worth re-emphasizing why getting to that point is so unlikely. We have already referenced the Cuban Missile Crisis twice here. That process began with the Soviet Union deploying nuclear weapons to Cuba. However, it ended with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev believing that the situation had gotten out of hand and regretting the preliminary steps that got him there. Only 2 years after that, he was gone from power, with his Cuban missteps motivating the coup plotters' decision. And all of that occurred without a nuclear weapon fired, only 1 American casualty, and no Soviet casualties. Consequently, the chances we reach a point past this today are slim. Nevertheless, let's work through the post-nuclear options, beginning with do nothing. This is essentially the earlier preemptive announcement option, just in a different phase. Perhaps deployment of tactical nuclear weapons will not be enough to sway China, India, and European stragglers to cut economic ties. Maybe they just figure that the threats are bluffs, and therefore are not worth reacting to. Of course, an actual attack would end any false belief about a bluff, which then may inspire them to stop spinning in circles and take financial action, despite their unwillingness to do so beforehand. Unless the US anticipates that additional Russian attacks are imminent, which would then necessitate a more immediate response, I suspect that the wait-and-see approach would be Washington's preferred starting point, with further options crafted based on what the neutral parties do. A single tactical nuclear weapon would kill more Ukrainians than any other single action before it, but Ukraine's military personnel and materiel are spaced out enough that Kyiv would not be in any immediate danger. That, in turn, affords the United States the time to wait. However, if condemnation and meaningful action from elsewhere are not forthcoming, then the US has a choice to make. First, it can just accept that Russia wants to take serious risks, and that it is not worth provoking Moscow further. But that is unlikely when the next rung of the escalatory ladder is mere economic sanctions. Yep, back to the money. Doing nothing is unlikely. As the predominant global superpower, the United States benefits disproportionately from maintaining global order. Nuclear weapons have only been used offensively twice, both times ironically ordered by Washington. Nevertheless, much of the United States' post-Cold War agenda has focused on limiting and reducing nuclear arsenals. Sleeping on the job while another country breaks the major non-nuclear norm, and offensively no less, would be a major deviation in policy. Washington instead would want to leave the snoozles to the puppers. In other words, doing something is in the cards, and thus we go back to the money once again. It may seem surprising that there are still sanctioning steps that Washington could take, but the economic relationship isn't entirely severed. The easiest target there could be Russia's currency reserves. You might remember them from the beginning of the war, and how Russia had a fatal flaw with its fortress economy. Moscow had saved up more than $600 billion in a rainy day fund, but had placed $300 billion in the hands of Western governments. Sanctions froze that money, but the governments did not confiscate it. Instead, the cash is being held hostage. The United States appears to control about $100 billion of that. Following a nuclear attack, the US could announce that some fraction of the money will be permanently seized and then paid to Ukraine as reparations, and that any further attacks would result in a further drawdown from the money that the US controls. The problem here is that, given existing law, Congress would have to declare war to do that, which is not happening, given that the Kremlin already wants to cast the Ukraine conflict as a war against NATO. Congress could pass new legislation to get around the war declaration, but regardless, sovereign funds are rarely touched, and doing so would give further pause to countries that use the US financial system. A more layered option is to ramp up secondary sanctions. Unlike primary sanctions, these are sanctions not placed on the direct coercive target, but rather on countries not supporting the sanctions regime. For example, the United States could impose secondary sanctions on India, China, or whoever else until those countries also begin squeezing Russia. If a financial attack is not enough, the next step is expanded military aid to Ukraine. As we discussed a moment ago, the US has restricted its assistance to Ukraine, forbidding American weaponry from hitting inside of Russia. In practice, the most noteworthy limitation here is with the HIMARS system. As we have covered before, missiles for HIMARS come in two flavors. First is the standard GMLRS, or GIMLRS, that go about 90 kilometers. These are what Ukraine has been using throughout the war thus far. But Ukraine would really like access to ATACMS, or ATACMS, that go 300 kilometers. If the US wants to punish Russia without directly getting involved, ATACMS is a middle ground, allowing Ukraine to dole out the additional punishment. However, much of the need for ATACMS has been supplanted by the United Kingdom's Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of 250 kilometers, just short of ATACMS. Thus, these weapons would allow Ukraine to up the quantity of attacks, rather than cause a major revolution on the battlefield. The United States has already shown a willingness to send ATACMS over, with a bunch of Russian assault helicopters destroyed in October 2023. But these were a limited quantity of the shorter-range cluster variety. Washington could send more, or send the longer-range ones in response to a nuclear attack. Or, alternatively, they could go with more traditional armored vehicles. Before going forward, we need to have a brief Article 5 interlude. That, of course, is the aforementioned provision in the North Atlantic Treaty that declares an attack on one NATO country an attack on all NATO countries. This would seem to not matter given our focus on Russian tactical nuclear weapons targeting Ukraine, but not so fast. Depending on wind patterns, it is possible that the radioactive fallout will drift into NATO territory, which is starting to sound like an attack, even if it is indirect. However, the treaty only requires that the states meet to discuss how to respond. It does not guarantee a powerful military retaliation. But if they want to, or if the US wants to without any Article 5 invitations, then there are some options. Next on the escalatory ladder is an after-the-fact attack on the weapons sites. We actually have a direct parallel for this. The city of Douma, Syria was hit with chemical weapons, that is, weapons of mass destruction, on April 7, 2018. Western intelligence immediately implicated the Syrian government as the perpetrators. 1 week later, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France struck back at 2 targets. The first was the Barza Scientific Research Center, the location of the alleged chemical weapons production. The second was the Him-Shinshar military installation, where the alleged weapons were stored. The big difference with Ukraine, of course, is that the WMD is nuclear rather than chemical. But the US could do something similar by sending some freedom to the locations related to the vector of attack. Russia may still retaliate, but the move would be substantially less aggressive than a proactive attack, and might mitigate how Russia responds. Still, the United States will need to exercise some caution here. Targeting locations that have further nuclear weapons once again puts Russia in the use-it-or-lose-it dilemma, which Washington would be wise to avoid. Going further up the ladder, the United States could opt for an expanded strike. This goes beyond hitting things directly connected to Russia's tactical nuclear weapons, and moves toward enfeebling Russia's ability to fight in Ukraine. Such a middle-ranged response sticks to conventional weapons. That might seem weird because the standard mutually assured destruction doctrine is the use of nuclear weapons to fight nuclear weapons. However, cross-domain deterrence is a common solution to these types of conflict situations. That's when one state tries to convince an opposing state to stop using a particular vector of attack, say nuclear weapons, by using a completely different vector, like conventional plane-fired missiles. It's 2 different weapons domains, hence the name. Cross-domain deterrence is an old problem, but is undergoing a renaissance with cyber and space as new relevant vectors. Employing it gives the United States some flexibility. For example, the United States could covertly shut down Russia's electrical grid, supposing that hackers have that ability. This affords the Kremlin the option of simply not having its spokesperson publicize the United States' role, allowing the 2 governments to engage in a bizarre form of collusion to prevent the conflict from spiraling further. This type of action is more common than it may seem, in large part due to how it is intentionally designed to keep things quiet. And if that sounds interesting, this entire book focuses on the topic. In contrast, a literal tit-for-tat would require the United States to fire a tactical nuclear weapon back at Russian troops. This would be a strange option for 3 reasons. 1. Most of what the United States would want to target is sitting in Ukraine, and I doubt Kyiv would be too thrilled if, in response to Russia irradiating Ukraine, the United States also irradiated Ukraine. Second, if the target were instead in Russia, well, then the United States just fired a nuclear weapon on Russia. What are the odds that the Kremlin would respond to that with a similar yield nuclear weapon targeting a Western country? Unclear. But whatever the probability, we are now reaching a point where things could spiral out of control. It is also worth noting that, as of this signing ceremony, Russian law says that the places where combat is currently taking place are Russian federal grounds. Thus, from the Kremlin's perspective, even if not international law's perspective, Problem 1 has the same problem as Problem 2. Of course, in practice, Russians are less inclined to pay costs for Kherson than St. Petersburg, but you can bet that you will hear this rhetoric coming from the Kremlin anyway. Third, the United States could avoid nuclear winter and achieve the same goal by using conventional means instead. During the Cold War, the United States raced to build tactical nuclear weapons because the Soviet army could rapidly outnumber NATO forces. As the Cold War ended, that equation flipped on its head. The United States found itself with a growing list of allies heading eastward. Meanwhile, over in Russia, the country started hemorrhaging rubles. Thus, Russia kept the heft of its stockpile as a way to combat its own manpower issues, while the United States reduced its tactical arsenal in Europe to just 100. The idea was that conventional weapons could do most of what the United States wanted to accomplish, but without the command and control concerns. As such, today, in terms of a response to a tactical nuclear attack on Ukraine, the United States could just replace its tactical nuclear vector with something conventional, do the same damage, and not have China and India get on Washington's back. Finally, the maximal option is a strategic nuclear weapon strike. But if a tactical nuclear weapon is a silly form of retaliation, then bombing Russian cities is just ridiculous. In fact, it would be as absurd as having chicken power a nuclear weapon. Wait, what? The British already developed a chicken-powered nuclear bomb? What is it with Britain and chicken? Oh well, I guess I know what we're going to do for our sign-off then. Anyway, the number of nuclear weapons each state has is gigantic. And while they are down from the insanity of Cold War levels, we could still end human civilization as we know it many times over. The US keeps 5,400 some odd bombs in reserve, in case Russia decides to do something adventurous, like nuke Austin, Texas, or stage a ground invasion of Washington, D.C. So while this is technically on the menu, Biden will not be ordering it. But even with those responses off the table, the damage to Russia's war effort will be significant. As a result, Putin is unlikely to challenge international norms against the use of nuclear weapons. Still, we have discussed before that Putin has incentives to gamble on the war's outcome. That might make it difficult for us to fully relax on a beach somewhere, but a gamble must have some upside to justify the risk. Even if Putin thinks he will face trouble at home if he withdraws from Ukraine without much to show, we recently discussed how Putin is not immediately doomed to lose office. It is reasonable to believe that the chances that he survives by simply withdrawing are higher than what would happen if he rolled the dice on a tactical nuclear weapon. That is why Russia withdrew from Kherson in November 2022 without firing a nuke. And yet, that was a logical time to use a nuclear weapon. Kherson City is the capital of the oblast, and like we said before, by Russian law, it was therefore a capital within the Russian Federation. But gambling over that was still a bad idea, so Putin kept the bombs in the basement. Obviously, miscalculations can happen. That is how Russia got into this war in the first place. So close. But the upshot is that nuclear weapons are a gamble that is generally known to be unwise. In contrast, do you know what is a wise move? Reading a book that investigates the many possible causes of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. They called it the Blue Peacock. Like the United States, the United Kingdom worried about the Soviet Union's manpower advantage in continental Europe. Worse, the North German plain gave Moscow a lot of running room out to the Atlantic. One solution that British war planners arrived at was landmines. More specifically, nuclear landmines. As the theory went, you could bury them into the plain, wait for the Eastern forces to get close, and then boom goes the dynamite. Even if you did not kill that many, you would still irradiate the area for a long time, thereby forcing soldiers to march through more mountainous terrain. One problem for the Blue Peacock. If you tried burying it in the middle of the winter, the temperature transfer from the surrounding soil would cause its components to fail. Obviously, the United Kingdom never had to fully solve this problem, as the Cold War never culminated in a land war in Europe. But one proposal was to use chicken. The casing of the Blue Peacock was large enough for a handful of chicken to be put inside. Add a little bit of food and water, and they might survive for a week. Their body heat would be just enough to keep the bomb functioning, and thus keep Britain in a position to wreak havoc on Russians, and cause some clucking nightmares. No word on whether the Cold War-era British liked their chicken Kyiv cooked to 1,000,000 degrees.